Welcome everybody to the fifth webinar that we've done in 2021. I think it's number 77 overall, or somewhere in that range. So, been doing these for since March of 2020, having a great time. James and I, our co-host today, were chatting earlier that lots of great questions come from folks based on these, and lots of entertaining information that we've been putting out, and everybody seems to really be enjoying them. So and we certainly are enjoying doing them and helping everybody get up to speed a little bit more. So appreciate it very much. This one is going to be a little bit different, and I'm really looking forward to it. It's we're going to talk about with our co-host James Colborn, who gave one on learning styles, 2 or 3 months ago, and it was very, very well received. And so what we're going to do here is, while it's titled Adapting Your Learning Style, and we're going to talk about that, and we're going to kind of focus on that, but we're going to also keep in mind that we're going to have a data analysis lesson going on as well, and maybe some things you don't know about that. So while we are talking about learning styles and how you can use your data better and get different ways of looking at it, that's a big part of what we're going to do today. But we're also going to talk about tire pressures and temperatures and how they affect speed, and some stuff that James learned about that. So we're going to wrap that all up into one really cool little lesson here that I think everybody's really going to enjoy. So looking forward to that. Let's jump to the next slide and let's introduce James. This is James's 6th time co-hosting with us. So we've been wearing him out, but he's a trooper. So he keeps with us and keeps coming back for more. But known James for quite a while. He lived in my area, raced in my area here in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and I got to know him back then. And I was putting on it was even pre. When I was an employee of AIM, I was doing some seminars with AIM's help, and doing some around the country. And whenever I was in the Northwest, we did a couple of them up here, and James was always there, and just hungry to learn. And it's great to watch his path that he has taken. Number one, to become a better racer, in motorsports and the things he's done, but also learning much more about data. And then now he's taken on a role of producing how-to videos on YouTube and talking about data and how to read it, and helping many other people with the knowledge that he has gained as well. So pretty darn cool. And welcome, James. I appreciate you coming. A longtime friend, but I appreciate you coming and doing these with us every once in a while. Hopefully you'll continue to do some more in the future. So tell everybody a little bit more about you, and we'll get started into the topic.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me again. It's always delightful to be here. And just to talk about something which I have great passion for. I think that I'm one of those who needs to sort of continue to be able to sort of work through how do I improve my driving. It's one of those things that last year was, and we'll talk about that as we go through, and I think many people can relate to this. Last year was one of the best years that I think I have from a learning point of view, because in large part due to these seminars. We were in a situation where, we were in lockdown, feels very familiar to today. And there was new information to be had. And one of the things that you may also see listed here, which is something that I encourage a lot of people to think about, is that I've been working lately on not only videos to help and my own racing, of which I've gone for a nice black and white theme here today. I forgot that my face would be on camera, so I went with slightly obscured profile photograph, only realizing that people would still see what I look like on the actual video. But the reality is that I've been looking a lot at sim racing lately, and I have access to an MXP Strata Dash. And that's been fun in terms of a learning and things of setting up new experiences. It's like, oh, I need some new data for that. Hold on, 5 minutes later, back again. Let's have a look at that data now. And so it's changed a lot of the way that I sort of approach things. And so I've talked a lot about my sort of experiences with creating how-to videos and everything. But last year was 2 major reasons that, I really sort of appreciated these sort of sessions. Was the first is that I got to be able to sort of learn new things. And then the second, which we're going to talk a little bit about today, is that I got to start applying them. And I think it's the application of what you learn is the bit that you go from that sort of, oh, that's cool, to that's useful. And I think that the transition to that's useful is something that I think a lot of people want to get to. Some people are already there, but it never stops. And that's what we're going to focus on.
It's funny, the more you learn and the more that you start to apply it, you find that the pool of available things to learn is deeper and bigger all the time. So it's which I think is a topic of a slide that's going to come up here soon. So perfect. I'm going to give control to James. And again, as we go through, if you have a question that maybe gets brought up, make sure you put it into the question and answer. The presentation that we're looking at is will be linked in the chat box here in just a moment. It may have gone by already. If you're watching this on YouTube later, everything that I talk about is going to be linked into the chat box. For the live folks, is going to be down in the description box, including this presentation, because there's some pretty cool tips and tricks he's going to show you. So you can grab this presentation as a PDF file. The data that is going to be used today is available. The profiles, all that kind of stuff will be available to be linked down below. So you can open that up and then follow along with some of the stuff that James does as we go through. So it's going to be a great time. James, I'm going to give you control of the mouse, and remember, you got to click on it one time to make it active so everybody can see you. See, there you go, and then click away, and you are off and running.
Fantastic. And so today I want to be able to think about the fact that many people, I'm sure, on this call are familiar with AIM devices. Last year probably was a big sort of area of development. Many of you may be coaches, maybe you maybe help people with understanding and developing their driving. And I think that one of the things that's particularly interesting is the fact that, you know, there's a journey or path that we often follow to be able to get there. So I've been talking about this. Last time we sat down, I wanted to do a refresher, first of all, on the data journey. And I was having a debate, is this a data journey or is this a driver development journey? And I think the question is this both? And it's one of those areas that I see this chart and this model used in so many different scenarios, which is, you know, where you move through the competence curve as relates to familiarity with a number of things. So we talk about it in this context in terms of data. But in the other instances, okay, so what do I do with that data to be able to make it useful? And I'm probably going to harp on a bit about the useful section today a little bit. So apologies in advance for repetition of phrases. But one of the key aspects is, I'm sure many of you have experienced that moment where you've walked somebody through some data, or if you walk through it yourself, you leave, you come back again, and what did you do again? How did you get there? How did you see it? And it's sort of, it's something that sort of needs to be addressed. And so the first thing I want to do is let's take a moment to think about where everyone is here in terms of this data journey. And you don't need to necessarily say and everything in the chat box, but I think it's interesting that we think about it in relation to, you start out with unconscious incompetence. I don't know what I don't know. I don't know if I'm doing it right or wrong. I've just got no idea in terms of what's going on. And anyone who's turned a wheel in a race car, I'm sure, has felt like that on a constant basis. I feel like that many times. And then you get into, you know, an area where we think about data, and that's that experience that you turn on. And I always remember Race Studio 2 analysis, Race Studio 3 analysis. I know Emiliano's on here, so you probably smile. It's much easier the first time you turn it on. But when you turn on Race Studio 2 analysis, if you remember that first time you did it, you're just presented with a page of everything overlaid on top of each other. There's no formatting of the measures graph. The measures graph is all you see. It's a lot of colors. Sometimes they're a little bit luminous, and it's just overwhelmingly frightening and unpleasant. And that's how I felt before I went to one of Roger's seminars, where I was like, this is intimidating. I'll just use it here for a lap timer, which is where so many people probably, as they did experiences with me, put their AIM Solo in their car. And or if they had a dash, they were using it to be able to say, well, this is a nicer version of having, you know, 3 or 4 gauges for water temperature or oil pressure. And so, you know, there's all this wonderful data held in the box, but the first time you plug it in, you just want to run a mile. And that's where you're in that unconscious incompetence phase. It's like, I have no idea what this is, just in terms of where it is. And so, you know, you get from that point to moving to the conscious incompetence, which is the next thing. And this is where I think a lot of people sometimes sit, I do constantly, is you get to this conscious incompetence, which is, well, I know what I should be doing it, but unless someone's standing next to me or doing it for me, I don't quite know what's going on. And that's in many respects, which is, I don't know if anyone has experienced this with the software or any software in particular, but as we start thinking about data, lots of buttons on a page, which you've no idea which any of those buttons do. But it's one of those things that now you're starting to get, well, I wish I knew which button gave me the view that showed me how I'm doing in driving. A great moment here that goes from the unconscious incompetence to the conscious is, in many respects, finding a way of being able to make this easy for people to be able to not only visualize, but also to be able to comprehend. So we talked about some examples last time that here, and it's a feature that I know, I imagine Roger is going to do another sort of webinar on it, was the lap replay analysis. The two dots on the screen were my personal aha moment, because I could see the two dots on the screen. I'm like, oh, that one's in front of that one. Super scientific, I'm sure you'll appreciate in terms of my comprehension here. But if that car's in front of that car, well, that one pulls away more and there's a gap down the straightaway and then there's a little indicator. That's where you start getting into that moment of sort of, oh, okay, I start to get it. And then you start developing from there. And then you get into the point where you've figured it out. And so I would argue that so many of us, thanks to last year, are in the figured it out phase. This is something which I find still to this day, people do love, in many respects, this is the how to sort of look at your data type tutorials that we create. And it's figuring it out. It's like, okay, I get it, but I need to do it slowly, step by step by step. Whereas someone like Roger, for example, or Peter Krause, or Matt Romanowski, or anyone would look at it, would turn on this page, look at the data, and with a nanosecond will be there going, oh, that's happening. That's where you get into that unconscious competence phase, or this skilled phase, where you just look at it and go, oh, you need to be improving it a little bit in turn one, you're braking a bit too late, or your braking's inconsistent, or you're not using, you're not going on the throttle smoothly, or whatever need be. And people are like, how do you see that? But it's getting to that point. And one of the problems is that I think some people talk to people who are at the skilled phase when they're in the lack of awareness phase, and this gap between the two, you're like, yep, not drawing the connection. So the goal, I think, in many respects, in terms of this data journey we go on, how we help people, is that you have to find that bridge that joins the dots. And that bridge can come in the form of colleagues, it can come in the form of tutorials, it can come in the form of things like lap replay analysis. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, because I fell very much, as we all do, into number 3. Haven't figured it all out yet. And so I'm one of those who feels relatively confident in so much of what I do with the data that I feel that I can make useful, actionable outcomes from the data that I do. But just like anything, you add another variable into the equation, and it sometimes sort of muddies the water in terms of not sure what this is saying, don't quite know what's going on. And so that just happened to me.
And I'll break in for a second. What I think is really cool is you have done this twice, right? Many more than that, but what we're going to talk about today, you've done it twice. One was with the track replay function, got you to a point, and the next one we're going to actually clarify a little bit more today, which was a whole different way of learning, but it took you to another level. And I think that is the aha moment is not always the same for number one everybody, but it's not even the same for each individual person for each step along the way, which I think is going to be pretty cool to see today.
I appreciate that, Roger, and that's absolutely right. It's we are always in this, and I think that that's the thing that we all need. I'm sure everyone who attends these every week is there's never a situation where we figured it all out. And I want to make sure that if you have, my hats off to you. That's brilliant. Yeah. But the beauty of what's happening, and this is where I just explained a minute in today's focus, is that all of a sudden we start transitioning through experiences with the data. We move from, I'll use my personal data journey. Not only did I figure it out, but as I figured it out, I added more. I went from an AIM solo to an MXL pista, which was kind of cool. And then I went from there to an MXL2. And the difference between a pista and an MXL2 is that I had colors and lights and alarms and all sorts of new functions. And then, I moved up to adding in the Smarty Cam. And every time I added one of these variables, I hit number 3 and I went backwards again because it added new components. And that's the beauty of what's happening. So the reason I wanted to talk about that today, and point number 3, is that everyone's going to be in that haven't figured it out phase. But the beauty of what's happening in the automotive industry, especially when it comes to sort of race technology and everything, is that the barriers to entry continue to be low. I mean, obviously biased towards today's conversation as it relates to AIM, but I truly believe that the AIM Solo was the removal of the barrier to entry for race car telemetry for the average club racer and driver. Average, not in performance, but just lowest common denominator of driver. That's a scenario that now we're in a position where more and more things that used to be unobtainable are now becoming more prominent. 20 years ago, it would have been $5,000 or more to be able to get some kind of race telemetry system in your car. 10 years ago, it was $400. It's still, to some degree, that same price point. But what we're going to focus on today is this. Now, this is the beautiful interior of my Formula Ford. You can see I've had it nicely designed by Van Diemen in 1988 and hasn't improved then. If this were somebody's house, it would have beautiful browns and mauves and green colors with maybe stripy flooring and delightful curtains. But what we have today here is an example of the fact that the thing I've got bolted onto the steering wheel, by the way, this was a new steering wheel. It was such a wonderful day to have a new steering wheel to play with. But what you've got here is you have something that added that new variable. It was something that when I was racing in the US, I raced in E30s and BMWs, and a Spec E46 was the last car I had. This type of technology wasn't available, and now, you know, we're in the realms of $250, $300 or pounds for some form of tire pressure monitoring system, which was $3,000 or £3,000 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And so now we've got this point where, ooh, new input. We're flooding it back into the system, and we're starting to then say, okay, I can start analyzing. So the first thing that you'll probably notice here, except for the fact that my oil pressure is low, the car wasn't running at the time, I might add, is that you'll notice on screen that I have the tire pressures. And if we think back to that example that I gave earlier, which was, hey, how many of us had an AIM Solo, where we used it as a lap timer? Having tire pressures on the steering wheel was great because I could tell what my pressures were. But I'm sure many of you know, but I don't. How do you know how to analyze tire pressure data? What's a good way of being able to use the knowledge you gain from that tire pressure analysis to be able to make actionable, and again, excuse the repetition, useful data inputs? And this is the thing that I was getting to the point where I need to start figuring this out. And so to give you an idea of where this was just useful, even on track without knowing anything, I drove over some debris at one point, and the car felt funny. So just one variable I could take out of my mind is, do I have a puncture? This helped prove that almost immediately. So there's always going to be that use for the tire pressure in the car, even from the most simple sort of crude application, but there's so much more. And that's that treasure trove of data that's held within the device itself. So what I did was that I put down here, this was my approach, relatively novice. I'm like, okay, what do I know about the AIM system, and what can I do to be able to start understanding certain variables? Now, the sessions that I ran the first time, in fact, all sessions, all 18 sessions, or not quite that many, but after I did a sort of the Walter Hayes Trophy, which was sort of a heat knockout, which had, I have no idea how many sessions, plus a race plus practice at Donington, I must be 15 sessions, of which every single one was in the rain. So I'm still not absolutely clear on exactly the right temperatures and pressures and everything that need to be in the dry. But that's November and October in the UK. The thing that you'll see here is that my first approach was to be able to say, okay, I want to work through that magic variable. And the magic variable is, which anyone who races anything is, what's the right tire pressure in any instance, but what's the right tire pressure to have in the rain? And you know, I found this at the race at the Walter Hayes, and it's funny. I know there's somebody on the call here who I've traded an email with on the call. Makes me sound ancient. On the the webinar that we traded an email with, and the dialogue was, so optimal tire pressure for a Formula Ford start at maybe 16, 18 psi, gets up to around 20, everything's fine. Well, what about should we do in the rain? Well, let's move it up to 30. And then I talked to somebody else in the garage and say, what are you using? Oh, I tried 40. I was like, wow, that's a big spread. Did it make any difference? No, I didn't notice any difference at all between 30 and 40. You're like, this is interesting. And so there's a lot of experience and there's a lot of information. But now all of a sudden in a car built in 1988, I have inputs that you traditionally now only get with the most modern of modern street cars when you think about tire pressure monitoring system. And that's the beauty of a lot of these things that used to be unobtainable and now being developed in cars. And so I'm like, great, let's start working on the hypothesis that I had starting out, which was what's the perfect temperature and pressure for maximum grip. And so I went about, first of all, and it's in this little box down here. I'm going to do a live demo so I can show you some of this stuff later on. The first thing I thought is, okay, well, let's look at the tire pressures over each of the laps. And so the first thing I did was I created an average, a math channel in Race Studio 3 Analysis Beta that said, what's the average of all of the pressures of the front two and the rear two tires? And then averaged it out and said, I want to know what the average, I want to know what the maximum of that average was per lap. That will give me what the pressures were of the average across all 4 tires per lap. And I'm like, okay, great, do that with pressure. And let's do that with temperature, because that will tell me roughly, what the graduated increase is going to be in terms of pressures per lap. And that will help me. And then I said, well, I need some kind of variable to contrast that against. And so obviously grip is the parameter. So I was like, well, okay, well, let's use G-sum, because G-sum's a great measure of getting an idea of what the maximum type of G forces are being used in relation to the car. And it's an analysis that one of the things that I learned about last year. So I put that all together and loaded up a channels report. And the beauty of the new one is you can actually add a graph on the right-hand side that said, show me, based upon the maximum, this one says tire temperature on the right-hand side, what is the average G-sum per lap? And do I get to a point where I reach a tipping point that the average pressures or temperatures get too high and the average G-sum that I have goes down? And interestingly, the test that I had was relatively inconclusive, in that had I run 25 laps, which is almost impossible to do in a Formula Ford race, which is usually 10, 15 minutes, it was so hard to be able to get that variable. So I was like, okay, well, maybe you can see here that we've got a scenario where I'm like, okay, this is interesting, that we've started to see more and more grip, and it starts going down again. So maybe this is the optimal point in terms of tire temperature here, where we get to the maximum amount of grip. And you can see that here on this chart, that it's around between 23.7 degrees and 25.3. Not that the decibel makes a huge amount of difference, but it's useful to have there in terms of where that is. I'm like, okay, that's really interesting. And then we did the same thing with pressures. And so what's the optimal pressure type of threshold then there as well? So it's like, oh, so that's super duper interesting. But at the same time, is it just a fluke? Did I, for example, slow down? There's loads of other variables to be able to put on there. It's raining. Did I run through a puddle? What was the variable that sort of changed that? And with 1 lap difference, a trend doesn't make. This, you'd argue, is a trend. I'm quite happy with that. But this, not so much. And then the race was over, or the session was over. So I'm not necessarily there. So what I did, and this is where I get to that point number 3, and I'm in this sort of like, this is what I know, but I don't know what I don't know type of approach. I know what I'll do. I'll phone up somebody who knows what they're doing and ask them. And there's millions of people I could have phoned, but I actually talked to Matt Romanowski, because he has access to a lot of these tire pressure monitoring systems. And I posted something online, said, hey, I've got a new tire. I posted this picture, and Matt's like, let's talk after your race about what's going on there, probably knowing, of course, that I wouldn't have an understanding at all of what was going on, which was there. And so we did. And so Matt said, okay, we need to start thinking about this a little bit more, per tire, and something which is useful. And so introduced me to the XY plot. And now I'd use the XY plot a little bit for a friction circle, but I was never a huge proponent of it. And I've got to be honest, most of you who've probably seen the XY plot only think friction circle. If you don't, good on you.
Good for
amazing.
you.
That's fantastic. If you do and you're like me, you're like, okay, yep, friction circle, that's fair enough. And so what Matt suggested was that what we need to do here is to think about it in terms of, let's build, we did this in Race Studio 2 analysis, which was very, very complicated. Sort of make something, I can't remember what we did. And Matt can join us in a minute and probably help us understand what this is going to be. But said, okay, so the key is if this is the front left, front right, and rear left, we need to sort of start to identify some variables. And so let's plot out every time the system takes a measure between what the spread is from lateral acceleration, so left and right hand turns and the maximums, and then the pressure that you see. Then select a whole bunch of laps, which is what I did here. And then the idea that what you want to be able to see here from a pressure point of view is that the tire pressure that has the maximum spread across these areas is the pressure that's giving you the most amount of grip through the tire. And I was like, that's genius. I would have never have thought of that. And he sort of explained it in this, which is which pressure across the threshold gives you the broadest set of grip. And so I posted this on the AIM user group Facebook the other day saying, I need to explain through this because it took me a while to sort of work through this as well. So this is the idea. If we go back to this chart, which pressure range gives you the maximum. So you want to see the highest dot here and the, well, highest or lowest dot, depending on what you have here. And whichever one of those has the broadest spread is the pressure that gives you the most amount of grip. I'm like, oh my God, that's amazing. That makes so much more sense than trying to work through Chandler's report and seeing if there's a trend. And so as we went back to this measure, now all of a sudden we can see that as these metrics are taken, we can now start to see that this I wouldn't say it was inconclusive because we can start looking at it. And I don't know if we want to bring Matt into the conversation now.
Let's do that in a second. But the what I think is cool. Number one, we're going to talk about pressures and temperatures and how to see that in the data. But let's tie it back to the learning style thing as we kind of go forward. These webinars and many other things around many of us not being able to go to the track and being kind of locked up for a while has benefited us in weird ways with our motorsport side, at least, where we begin to dig in and start learning and do some different things. Matt Romanowski, if Matt, you can turn on your camera if you would, please. Matt has come on here with us a bunch of times and done and helped us out with different webinars. He's chatting with people like you around the world and about topics like this. And you went from learning some things based on some webinars and some of your own trials and things like that. And the lap replay function was something. And you've got yourself up to that point on your chart where you're up here. Okay, I know a little bit, but I want to know more. And so you kind of started the process and you reached out to some people in the community that you have met, a lot of them through these webinars, a lot of people that I see names in the list of folks that watch these and I get emails from as well. And I reach back to them and I learn things. We're introducing Matt now because he worked with you on a phone call, and we're going to just kind of go recreate that a little bit here and talk about what you guys talked about and what you ended up learning. So thanks, Matt, for coming and joining us. Matt has been here many times as a co-host, and we kind of thought at the last minute to throw Matt into the deep end here and bring him on again. But kind of recreate it, James, if you can take back control of the lead of the conversation, but you're now looking at it and you're trying to figure out exactly what all this means. So you get on the call with Matt for an hour, and it was a change in your data perspective that was quite large. You've talked to me about that. So chat about what you guys chatted about.
Yeah, we'll do. And I think that's exactly right. So I was here and I think I actually showed something similar to this to Matt, and he was sort of politely sort of like, as you do. And I'd argue that there's still, obviously very proud of my own analysis. I'm like, this is particularly useful. And it is not far off, but it's not, where to get to that point of how do we get to a comfortable point where there's enough sampling, enough information. And so I talked it through with Matt, and I think it's a very important sort of component, and it's a beautiful sort of scenario that describes our virtual world that we're starting to, embrace more, is that Matt and I did a screen share. And I said to Matt, well, what's the best way to be able to start thinking about how to be able to make this actionable? And, how do I get this to the point where I can start learning from this? And, I think, and Matt, it'd be interesting to get your point of view on this as well. How did you come about figuring out this as a threshold to be able to start thinking about tire pressure?
When I got the systems and I started looking at it, is I learned a lot about tire pressures from a previous guest host, Jorge. And when I did some sessions with him through the classes and things that he offered, he had done some things like this. And then all of a sudden it made sense to me. And the way I think a lot of times I sort of link things that if I know something, is it similar to something else? And this hit me as the idea of doing like a shock sweep. And I said, maybe instead of sweeping shocks, we can sweep tire pressures. So as the tire pressures grow, and as you have across the x-axis that it goes from 27 to 33, we see what does that do to lateral G's. And when Jorge had mentioned it, and then when I got the data and I started playing with it, that's how it made sense to me. And it's funny when you talk about learning styles and we talk about XY graphs, and how you said a lot of people only think of it as a friction circle. I always think of it as a correlation. I always think of it as how do these two things relate to each other. So to me, when I tried to visualize it in a different way, I kind of go through the various options that we have, and I say, oh, geez, a track map isn't going to help me on this, and maybe a regular distance plot won't help me. And I said, well, let's try an XY. And it was sort of process of elimination or some trials and looking at something and saying, geez, does this really help me? And I think the same way you started.
I love that. And so the reason that I wanted to sort of have Matt here is I'm probably going to show you some more data in a sort of a live demo as we go through. But the key to what was described there, and I'm going to go back to learning style again, is the fact that one of the key things that I think as you go through the phase of the aha moment and figuring it out is that there are always aspects of the trial and error. And I think that the beauty of what we have in many respects, and the reason that it's lovely to have someone like Matt, Roger, and any of your colleagues or your friends who you work with, is the fact that there's always that, does this make sense? Does this analysis make sense? And someone will say, well, no, I thought about it differently. I thought about it this way. And that's one of the key things in terms of sort of like the learning approach that I've personally found. I feel like sometimes a bit of a magpie that I steal things from everyone. One day I'll do something original. I'm not sure when that will be, but I'm always in a position where I'm lucky enough to have people who I, have that second chance and that second voice of being able to say, what do you think about this? What's this sort of helping, prove? Because ultimately, and we're going to look through this as we go into sort of a demonstration, is the fact that Matt sort of echoed something that I personally believe is really important, which is trial and error and getting comfortable with how, you want your own data. Because the key to much of what we do is we want to be in a position where we can get the actionable, useful information that we need as quickly as we can. And I think that for me, my learning style was trial and error till I get to the point where I'm not sure if this is conclusive. Okay, phone someone up or have a conversation with someone who I would never have thought about this in a million years to be able to sort of set this up. This is not my comfort area. It's not where I am. I was back down to stage number 1. I hadn't even figured out the aha moment. But this is where trial and error gets interesting, because now we start getting into, okay, so how do we make this useful? And if you remember back to that beautiful picture of the interior of my car, right now on the screen, we just have the tire pressures. And so the key is, so what am I going to do? Am I going to be looking at the screen the whole time going, well, hold on a second, the front left is in a perfect condition to be able to get the maximum amount of grip. Don't be a fool, James, make the most of this lap time now. Or can I go to another type of scenario where we may start thinking about something else? Now I have, as you probably saw from that, it's a GS dash connected to an Evo 4S. And one of the things that I've started personally to be able to think about is that, when we think about certain variables, when you do your analysis and you think about things like, I've done some data analysis comparison, I could roll 5 miles an hour more through that corner. So I'm going to gradually work towards that. And I've got a mile per hour gauge on the screen of any kind. See, I've got mine probably around here, although mine's not in kilometers per hour, it's miles per hour. A bit weird in the UK. We have, sort of metric and imperial all mixed together. But in many respects, it's one of those things where, I've got that sort of dash that I can go, okay, I can do that. But what about pressures? That's not easy when you're looking at 4 separate wheels that are there. So the beauty of what we started to work through with this analysis, and we'll look at it in another example in a minute, is that the ultimate tire pressure in this instance may not necessarily be the same for each tires. And what I do think is fascinating is the fact that one of the challenges is we always start our sessions, and many of us do. I know Matt doesn't, and he can probably talk through this in a minute in terms of some of his other learnings. But we start many of our sessions with, so what pressures am I at? Oh, we're at 16 all round. I'm like, okay, off we go. You don't need to. But the reality is that when you're up to speed, the pressures and the best grip doesn't necessarily come at universally the same pressure on every single corner of the car. And so as a result, that's very hard to manage. And so my sort of area of next area of development was do those courses last year. And again, it's slightly tire pressure related, but now it's looking at alarms and clever stuff you can do with a dash. Is how do I start making this useful for me in a car? So you probably noticed that I've set up right here, 4 little LEDs here that are green, and it says FL press good. So don't know why I shortened this. You can have as long as you like, but front left pressure is good. and so forth as you go down the sort of the mix. And so you're like, okay, this is interesting. But if I go one step further, I can show that I've created an alarm in the car with the fact that this is the channel that I have in the car. These are the variables. So I use the in-between variable. So if the tires get too cold behind a safety car, or we have safety cars, or, we actually did just recently, but in reality, sorry, I'll have a conversation with myself and forget that I'm doing a presentation in a minute. But in reality, I'm probably in a position where, definitely the pressure's getting too hot as I get overly excited and eager and in the car, is to be able to put in this threshold that says, once these pressures are between these, and I just put in 30 and 31 PSI. Now, granted, this was wet. I can't wait to do this in a dry so I can get some relevant element of consistency, because the next one could have been 25 and 26. You can then start set this up, but this is the front left. The front right could be 28 and 29. And once you've got that set up overall and have it until the condition's not met, and if the condition's not met, that means they're either too hot or too cold, you're in a position to be able to say, when I'm driving along now, I can light up all four of these. And if all four of those are there, that's that no excuse moment. That's that, oh, my tires weren't hot enough, or I didn't have enough pressure. The excuse t-shirt that everyone said that I've probably got on back order right now, that is exactly one of the ones that could be on there, which is, now I know, I didn't have I missed that opportunity with my tires and they got too hot and I couldn't put a lap time down. Now you can start challenging the way that you think and starting to think through actionable types of insight that you can have in the car. And again, it removes one of those elements that is there. And we all know that driving is as much driving in your head as driving on the track. And if one of the things you think about is, are the tires all right? Well, yeah, they are. Go for it, type of thing. And so this is where it gets actionable. And now I can start taking these learnings.
I'd like to sneak in one of our Q&A questions that has been there for a while from David Arkin. He meant, and maybe we just touch on it here, but David, I'd like you to know that I wrote that down as a note, as maybe as a upcoming webinar topic. I think it's worthy of discussing it much more depth. But David's question is, at what point do you think it is too much interference with data during a session? We can overwhelm a driver, obviously, right? At some point, the driver spending too much mental energy on data and not enough on driving. That's going to vary so much on the car and the driver and the track and all of that. But what James is showing here is something that works for him. It may not work for the next person. But so learning styles, right, and performance styles. What are your thoughts, James, on? You've tried this, and did it become overwhelming to the point where you were studying that maybe a little bit too much, or were you able to mentally continue to focus and just take that glance down on the straightaway?
It is such a fantastic question.
Yes, it is.
Because it is inherently one of the problems that I think those who are eager about data and the inputs that they get are definitely in that area. I'll switch to a live demo in a minute, but in this dash that I have here, at one point I had 5 pages, and one of them was just big mile an hour, and then one of them was this screen that's on here, and then one of them was associated with the tires. And I started to realize very quickly that if I made tire pressures the 5th click, and the time it takes me to get through the 5th click, I'm at the end of the straight, I don't have enough time to physically be able to understand all the variables that are available to me. And so what do I need as a bare minimum? And this, again, this is, remember when I opened up and said we've been working with the sim racing and using the dash to be able to practice what makes sense and what doesn't. It is so interesting how I got so eager and excited at the beginning with 72 different channels of data from the iRacing API and ECU stream, to the point now where if you look at the dashes I've set up in the car that I have, it is basically what position I'm in, how much fuel have I got left, what RPM, what's the speed, where do I shift? But I have added a few other variables as well that are key things that I want to work on. They may be alarms. So one of the things I've set up is an alarm based on how much tire pressure that I'm using in certain cars, so I don't lock the wheels and stuff like that. Hard to know when you're in a sim car and sim racing. And so in answer to your question, absolutely. And I think it depends on where you are. And this is where you get into your journey in relation to other aspects. If you're learning a track for the first time, I would argue you don't want anything more than the speed and the little LED indicators for predictive lap time. That's about it. You don't want anything more than that, because if you're trying to glance at the dash and saying, hey, did I do that corner better? And forgetting that the next corner goes left or right, we've all been there. We're like, oh, and sorry, a bit of sound effects there as well in terms of our in-car experiences, but in many respects, we've seen that. And so I think it depends on your comfort, what you want to see. And so what I've started to learn, this is a long-winded answer, is that this is again, another learning experience that I've learned from this. How many people here did what I did to start off with when you got a dash? And that was, you'd have one dash, and that was one config, and that's all you'd have. So when you went into your Race Studio 3, which is what we obviously use now, you created your dash config, that's all you had. Whereas this coming year, having identified the things I really want to work on, you could have a dash for qualifying, a dash for the race. If I wanted to work on some form of the braking analysis, especially based on some of the stuff we learned last week, a braking dash, and you load them up based upon the purposes you want to do, based on the session you're in. And I think that's where, you sort of advance. And so again, a learning style, you can only do that once you know what you know. And it's funny, if you don't know what you don't know what dash to set up. But it's the other thing, which is, and someone here has just written, Andy's written, startup, warm up, dash, testing, qualifying. Absolutely. I didn't start out doing that. And one of my key learnings, especially from what I've done with sim racing, is the dash for qualifying will probably be very similar to this, with a lot of green lights saying the tires are good. Whereas in a race, I could tell you, if these lights go out for the crashes are too high, but I'm within a car's width of the car in front of me, I'm not slowing down to save the pressure on my tires. I'm just going to keep going for it, no matter what happens. And so I think that that's a wonderful question for one of the inherent sort of, challenges that we have with data. And this one is a new one for me. I haven't tried it yet, but this is development from the fact that I only started to learn this tire pressure from Matt in November, I think it was.
Yeah, it's such a huge topic. I think it's a great topic for its own webinar. I mean, you think back to
without a shadow of a doubt.
You think back about my driving experience being an off-road guy. We literally had no gauges in the car, and then and I would have been confused with the even some basics. And then you go to a modern Formula One car to the absolute extreme, where they've got 27 knobs and they're adjusting their front toe down the straightaway and all sorts of stuff. It's a crazy difference. So don't want to get too deeply down that rabbit hole, but I thought it was a great question.
Superb question.
I think
any others?
I was to say, if I could jump in there too, I think that goes to James's point of you think you know exactly what you want on the dash, and then all of a sudden you realize you don't really know what you want on the dash anymore. And it brings you back to that learning of looking at it and saying, wait a minute, like I thought I wanted 5 screens, and really now I want 1. And it sounds like that's kind of the journey you had there, James, is that
it totally was. The other one, which was interesting, was I had a MXL2 and the whole dash would light up. But and it's designed to light up, and it is good if you've got an alarm, but if you use it for anything else, you're like, oh my God, what, where?
Yeah, you don't know.
And it's such an important component. So now I run just with the variables. So I always run with that tire pressure, which I did, because that helps me understand if I've got a puncture or not. And that genuinely was useful. But outside of that, I'm going to really, really work on my personal discipline as to what I need. And you can only know that once you've figured out, not only how to set it up, but what you want to be able to achieve. And I think it goes back to, then we get from the data journey to the driving journey. First steps of data is what I want to learn. Well, I want to know, how do I go faster? But that question is the most open-ended question that could exist in
Exactly.
any kind of analysis in absolutely perpetuity for every type of racing we do. So it's breaking it down. And so it's funny, I was doing a conversation the other day with a friend of mine, and he said, so you've done Formula Ford for a couple of years now. What are you really going to work on this year? And I was like, braking. I'm having a real tough time. Really, I said my corner entry's fine, my mid corner is good, my punch out of the corner is fab. I'm really happy about that. I can see that from max speeds and stuff like that on the track. But I'm losing out by being too tentative as a sort of a bit of a scaredy cat going in on brakes. So that's my focus. So I'm going to set up dashes and analysis and profiles to focus on braking. And that's that sort of going back to the driver learning moment as well. If you asked me the first year I stepped into a Ford, what are you doing wrong here? I would have said everything. But after 2 years, now I'm like, I want to work on this. Now, some drivers get that in about 10 minutes, but I'm not one of those. I'm a bit of a slow learner, so to speak.
You and me both. Before we dig into our live data, where we actually take a look at things, let me get through a couple of questions that kind of tied back to some of the stuff you talked about earlier. Tice asked, why does and I'm not sure it was Matt, but why does Matt have chosen GLAT instead of GSUM? That one screen, a couple of screens earlier, you were just working on the lateral G forces. If it was longitudinal, if you were trying to work on your braking and you were looking at that via tire pressure, you might have put longitudinal Gs in there to try to understand the biggest gap for performance for a tire pressure. But that's why I think they selected GLAT. And if you were looking for the bigger picture overall of the entry and out, then GSUM maybe was the right thing. The bottom line to Tice's question there is maybe you make 3 different XY plots and save those in your profile because maybe all of them are important, right?
Definitely.
I also
go ahead.
I was gonna say my reasoning for it was simply that GSUM has such an influence of what the driver is doing, versus lateral G is really what the car is doing. So I kind of
bit of driver input, but certainly a bigger picture of the car, right?
Right. So I try to take out some of that variable to do it.
Good. Art asked a question earlier. Don't need a ton of discussion on this one either, but why would running a large second or third gear figure 8 gathering data at the time, looking at your tire pressures, gains, and looking at the lateral longitudinal Gs, would it be good to gather that data? It would minimize the course and driver variations, certainly. And I think back to a very popular book in motorsports, The Unfair Advantage, with Mark Donohue when he was racing for Penske, and that was some of the testing that they did. They were early adopters of that. He had out behind the shop just a skid pad, and they were doing some rudimentary measurements of lateral Gs back in those days in the 60s and late 60s, and that's how they did it. If you have access to that, I think that'd be a great idea. You can't always get to a track. If you have a place you could do something like that and not get in too much trouble. I know the Formula SAE guys that I've worked with quite a bit. They have a parking lot over there. They can't go do a ton of testing. They're out there in the parking lot and they're doing skid pad testing all the time with and pressures and temperatures and suspension settings. So yeah, maybe might be a good way to do it. Again, many different ways of getting to the information, and your learning styles may be different, or your needs may be different. Kind of interesting. So, okay, James, let's take it to the next step. We've got about 15 minutes left.
Sure.
I'd like to look at maybe some live data. James is going to bring that up. I'm going to stop my share of the presentation materials, and James is going to take control of that. Let me try that again. I had to click twice. James should be able to share his screen, and we're going to let him run it from his end. I'll look through these questions, and we'll try to bleed that to bring some of those questions in as we go in a moment.
Brilliant. So what I want to do is, this might be a sort of like a user sort of engagement, but more than anything else, it's just starting to look at some of the stuff we've seen. What I wanted to show was some of the the live data that we've looked at, that we've got from some of this is my test. I have probably in this instance probably only about 40 or so different test sessions, just so I can work with it. Anyone who's used Race Studio 3 analysis are connected to their full dash of their full folder of AIM data. There's a lot in there. So I have a few that I use here for sampling, and one of them was a lot that I gathered from Silverstone. And so one of the things that Roger just said as well, which I wanted to be able to relate to, is when you get to figuring out where you are on your learning journey, sometimes it's important to know where you want to get to. And I think that that's sometimes an issue with data, is that people aren't sure that, you get that question, which is, I want to be able to go faster. But the question is, well, what do I want to work on? So I want to reiterate something. Before you figure out the journey, first you need to know your destination. And so I think that that's inherently part of what happens with the data, that when you're in the aha moment, you don't know anything. Is it braking? Is it steering? Is it acceleration? Is it line? What are those variables? But over time, the data journey gets easier once you know where your destination is going to be in terms of what you want to be working on. And I think that's a key aspect of, as you think through a lot of what's going on. That said, curiosity is also the best part of a lot of playing with data. And I don't know if any of you do this. I used to do this a lot because I used to fly a lot for races. I'd be clicking around and playing on data. Now I drive to the track, but before I would jump on an airplane. I'd be like, I got nothing to do. Let's have a look at the data from the weekend and see what's going on and see what was happening. Either lament a performance that wasn't there, or think that I've just put in the world's most amazing lap record if I'd done well. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this session here. Now, this again, it was raining, it was Silverstone, and it's the data that came, which was the one that Matt and I actually worked through. So obviously we've got our default view from Race Studio 3 analysis right here, but I have a user profile loaded, as almost as if I planned this before we sat down, called tire pressure analysis from what we're looking at. So if I load that up there, we're going to go back to that graph that I was looking at earlier. And so this is the view. Now, to be able to sort of set this up, it's so much simpler than anything else. And what I did for anyone who's interested, and we'll share the profile, I believe, Roger, and the data, that anyone can mimic a lot of this sort of stuff. You'll have this file to play with as well, which is hopefully going to be useful. It will show you all the channels. So the y-axis here is selected from this list, and then the x-axis. And Matt and I had an interesting conversation about this yesterday. I choose the x-axis on any of these by right-clicking in the graph itself and clicking choose the channel for the x-axis, which I choose the channel. So I set up 4 of these, just as we do with right-clicking and saying, add a box, choose the scatter graph that is there. Then I chose lateral acceleration, which appears on all the graphs that are here, which I'm looking for. And then I right-clicked and said, on this one, I want front left, and this one I want front right, and so forth. Now, there's some things which are still a relative mystery to me, why I've only got 1 lap listed, but there are 8 samples on the front left and only 2 on the right rear. I'm not sure. I don't understand it enough to it, but so to be able to make this work is that what I typically do here is I go in and I select, and again, guidance from Matt. This is again, I feel like I have that moment where I'm sort of saying, and I learned something here, and isn't it? But I learned this from Matt. And then one of the things that I like to do is you've seen me do this a million times, but it just makes visualization easier, is that I generally tend to go in and I color in some of the charts. Now, it's funny that this is the most boring webinar in the world, where you watch somebody who's selected 6 laps color them all the same, but you get the idea of the trend. And so what you'll see, though, is we're starting to get this sort of information, the data here, that makes this useful and actionable for us to be able to see. Now, on the last example that we gave, it wasn't as clear as a conclusive type of scenario to what we wanted to set up. Now, if you remember back to that dash setup that we had, we said that we want to be able to have that light come on between a certain threshold of pressures. But the other argument we made was that not every tire is going to have the right pressure for maximum grip based upon how you're driving around the track and sort of variables. And so you can see that the distance here, we want to find the one that's got the biggest spread, is nice and clear on all of these examples. Here, for example, hello, is that me? Here we can see that it is at about 25.5 psi. Here to here is the broadest spread. Actually, interestingly enough, it's around 24.5 here on this one. So again, if we're looking at different pressures for our little green lights to come up and say your tires are in a good place for maximum grip at Silverstone National, I would have a different temperature pressure range here to a different pressure range here. Similarly, on this front right, we're looking at this line of graphs, broadest spread that is here, and that's at, if we look here, at 23, so even less. And so what I wanted to be able to show here is that this is where you start to go in and you learn how to be able to apply each of these particular variables to what you're looking at, because the key component to what's happening is that you're not always going to have exactly the same temperature build or pressure build in the tires, based upon the fact that if we looked at this, I'd actually used the same data for a scatter graph the other day, or this is a scatter graph, sorry, it's scatter brain. I used it for a friction map, and noticed that if you think about, we laughed about this last time on the last seminar, Silverstone National's all right-hand turns except for one left-hand turn, which is why your pressures are changing by each of the tires by nature of how you're using different tires, which means that you need to know this particular variable as you think about how to set your pressures and set your tires as you go forward. And so this was just a quick sort of area of being able to say that all of this is available, but the beauty of it is I still have this graph that I've set up here with my analysis. I doubt that I'll probably ever use this thanks to the majesty of this particular view, but at the same time, in many respects, there are some other variables which I still don't know the answer to. I don't know if there's a difference between, is going to sound like the strangest thing. I don't know if there's a difference between pressure and temperature. But the question at that point is, it all relates around grip. So is there a combination of pressure and temperature, which I haven't figured out yet, which would be trial and error, that's some kind of formula that says, here's your perfect number for where your tires need to be that give you the both best pressure and grip? Because arguably you could get a hot tire because it's ballooned and has less grip, even though it's hotter. But similarly, you could have a colder tire that has more grip and slightly less pressure, but has a much flatter surface. So what's that right combination? And that's what I still personally need to be able to figure out. But that's where my trial and error will come into it now, in terms of figuring out what to do next.
Yeah, and that's not a black and white answer. You say, it's going to sound funny that you say that, but it's not funny. It's the tire versus, tire grip versus pressure versus temp. The end goal being grip, like you mentioned. But every tire that I've ever worked with, those two related variables are different, right? So if it's one brand of tire or one size of tire with the weight of your car, that pressure temp parallel is not always the same. So yeah, I agree with you. It's but the bottom line of what's cool about the data is the end goal is always maximum grip for the biggest period of time, right? And hitting when you want it. And that all you're doing is looking back and figuring out the other half of that equation, which is kind of cool.
I agree. And I totally agree with you, Roger. And I think that there's something that, we could be a continuation. It's like, hey, what did you learn as you went forward with this, James? It could be an interesting thing to be able to follow up. But the reality is that, yes, this was raining, and so we didn't get the full read.
Yeah.
It does help start answering that question that we raised right at the very beginning, which was, what PSI? Well, I tried 40. Well, I tried 30. Did you notice any difference? No. This might help answer some of those, sort of take some of that mystery for those sort of sessions. But the problem with rain is that you've never got the same conditions. But even in the dry, it could be a blistering hot, 75-degree day here in the British summertime. But, it could also be just like it was, raced at Donington in November, where it was sleeting and, the track was as cold as anything, as were my first experience of being in an open wheel car when it's as cold as that. Was amazing how I didn't feel my fingers for about 3 weeks. But at the same time, it's one of those things that, will that change it as well? And so I think there are other components. But this for me is, and if we go back, Roger, I'll stop sharing and hand back to you because I know we're coming close to the end. This for me was one of those sort of moments, which is I got right to the point where even my own trial and error, I just didn't know what I was doing. And that's where it was nice to be able to have that opportunity to be able to, to go back and follow your journey and go back again. And so I wanted to sort of end sort of today almost where we started, so to speak, in the fact that we need to go back to the data journey. And the fact is that if you think about everything that I tried, I was back here with tire pressure analysis. I really was. I was back in this sort of area going, I don't know if I can use what I just learned. But again, by coaching, by guidance, by help from friends and colleagues, you can get back and starting to work through different scenarios. And I've got to be honest, this was today talking about this, and that's what's new in the car that I have. But there's a high probability, I'll get there in the end, a high probability that you add some new components in, like, well, what happens based on how much fuel you've got in? And what happens if you've got a tire that's 5 heat cycles rather than 10 heat cycles? And what happens if it's a hot day or a cold day?
So many
variables. All of a sudden, I keep going backwards again. But I might not go back here because I've got a model to be able to work with, but I will always be working through here. So the key aspect to so much of this that, when we think about this journey that we're going through is that there's no shame and there's nothing wrong to getting back here. But the key is that always be learning, always be working through. But at the end of the day, one of the things that I think everyone on this call is probably in a position, because you're on this call, is that you have that end goal in mind. And this journey will just help you get there.
Let's jump through. Gosh, I can't even add anything more to that, right? That almost a perfect ending, except we've got a couple of questions. So I want to just quickly go through some of these. Maybe they'll be answered in the questions and answers that you guys have asked throughout this. We've got 5 or 6 here that we haven't answered, and we'll give a shot at. But we always take all of the questions, even the ones that were answered we typed answers and didn't talk about during the live webinar, we put those into a document, and within a day or so, those are going to be attached down in the comments box, in the description box in the YouTube video. So take a look at that. If you're watching this later, all of the questions that we're talking about will be either referred back to a timestamp in the video, or answered with text. A couple of things we'll talk about real quickly. Andy asked, did you start with the best cold pressures? I think he's working backwards to that. The discussion here was, let's get it up to where the pressures are warm, temperatures are warm, and getting the maximum G's. So then cold temperatures, I always work that backwards, get it working where it was, and then as they cool down, I record those as well, so we can get back to those warm temperatures as the tire warms up the next time. The other one he talked about was bleeders in the wheels. A lot of places that's not legal. Some places it is. I don't think you had those, right, James? You didn't have bleeders. You were setting the cold pressures and having to build up to warm, right?
Yes, that's right.
Perfect. Perfect. John asked the question, I'm thinking about buying a cheap wireless tire system, mounted, above our GS dash. That way the SmartyCam will record tire pressures for the entire session. Any ideas, yes or no? The answer to that is yes, to me. If you've got that data and you've got your SmartyCam, boy, getting those values and plugging them onto your video, especially if you're a visual learner and you're looking at your data later and looking at your video, and you see that the tire pressure was up to 32 and it felt, and your data your logging was showing that you were going faster and faster, I would have it on the SmartyCam video. I have no problem.
I would tend to agree with that. And I think the other thing as well is that one of the things that I notice and I started to develop is that, especially in the wet, sometimes the steering input on the car that I have, the Formula Ford, is super duper aggressive. Like you're full lock, trying to get the car to slow and turn at the same time. But the question that you have at that point is, that's endless scrubbing of the tire. What is that doing to the pressures in relation to, does that give you one opportunity in one corner and it slows you down in the others because you've gone too hot with the tire? So I think that's a really good point. And again, something else, I mean, all these questions are indicative of curiosity to be able to work against some of these variables, which, it's so interesting.
And if that is a general trend of that car, I realize you said a moment ago that your races are fairly short in that particular class, or at least the sessions you're doing. But boy, if that is the general build of the car and you have to throw a lot of front turn into it, what happens an hour into it, or 8 sessions of those tires down the road? Are you having to flip your rear tires for your fronts? There's all sorts of things that are built into that, right? You've worn out the fronts. So Alan asks a good question. Would all tires being at the same temperature indicate they are all working the same after a few laps, i.e. sharing the load and generating the same force? I'll take a crack at that one first, and then I'd feel it. You two take the same thing. I find that rarely to be true, because the course that you were just showing, it was so many right-hand turns. Yeah, even though we were in an ideal world, they would all be sharing the exact load, and that's probably what happened at the same temperatures and pressures. It just doesn't end up working that way. What I end up doing is starting cold and bringing them up, and my target has always been, or typically was, to get all tires to the same temperature, but same pressures. But it was rare. What I often ended up doing, there was a pound or two difference to get the maximum speed out of the car. What are your thoughts on what is the end goal? Is it to try to get those things at the same temperature, or are you looking at the end goal of strictly speed? Let the tires float where they may. What do you think, Matt?
So for me, I started out with the same idea you did, is that to put them all at the same pressure. But then actually, like when I went through today's journey and I started learning more about it, now I go to what is best for each one, because as you brought up, certain tracks have more left or right, trail brake, don't trail brake, whatever the load is on the tires, and they all build different. So you end up starting different and having, through the data, not what I'm guessing, but through my data that I've collected, says that each tire ends up wanting a different maximum pressure.
Interesting. We all think that certainly the cold pressures are going to be different because of those loads. Whether or not we end up at the same pressure when they're warm and actually doing it is a factor of the data to me. You watch what James and you discussed today, where we were showing those ultimate speeds and grip. That kind of drives that, right, James? Is that how you ended up kind of? You've only done it in the rain so far, but that's where you think you're going?
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm going. I think that what I'm looking for is to be able to remove a doubt that I'm not running at maximum grip. And I think that the graphs will show that. And then it'll give me what each of the pressures and the temps need to be. And if they're all equal at the maximum grip, so be it. If they're not, so be it. It really does give you sort of, and again, it's rather like saying, instead of taking that mystery out of it, we're removing mystery. And I think that's a key component to everything we do in racing, which is if we remove the unknown, then we can control it. If we don't know what we don't know, then we can't control it.
Then we make bad decisions based on what we do know, right? And so it's there ends to be you chase your tail. So
and you've got exactly bench talking. You've got bench racing. You've got experienced people. You've got people who've got different ideas. Everyone at that point, you'll have 1,000 inputs as to what the best thing is to do. It's rather like asking somebody which is the best part, which is the best neighborhood in New York to live. You'll always get a different answer because everyone loves where they live. It's so difficult to work on. It's the same thing, how you set your tire pressures or whatever. Plus, this is racing. You may not always get the right answer.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Another great place to end if we could, but we got a couple more questions. James is full of great comments. One I really do want to hit on, there's a couple here that are really deep that I'm not sure we can go into deeply, but isn't the data, David Arkin asks, isn't the data complete without the camber being recorded at the same time? Camber and other things, right? Probably brake bias and any number of things. David is absolutely correct. It is a piece that what the camber was and what the casters were and whatever it happens to be is a part of this, right? We just didn't show the entire notepad. So
totally right. And I think that gives you it's one more input to tell you what your setup needs to be. So if you go out on the track, it's 8 a.m., it's a beautiful sunny day, you arrive there a month later, it's 8 a.m., it's a beautiful sunny day, the temperature's the same, you've got everything you need just to be able to get the car to a point where you've got some consistent variables in terms of how you got your car set up. And so this is just one of those additional sort of aspects to be able to say, have I got it right?
And Matt would probably jump right in here and say in a minute, what he would do is take those same exact setup plots that we looked at a moment ago, right here, and change your camber in the middle of a session or something, and then the camber would be your x-axis across the bottom, and your G's would be changed, and you try to hold the tire pressures to be a constant, change your camber and look at when you were able to get the best grip out of it instead. So it is an iterative process, right? I mean, there's so many functions that change that you will end up building all of that stuff. So perfect. Is there a minimum range of pressures that make this statistically significant? Boy, I would say yes, but what is it, right? What what is it for a Goodyear versus a BF Goodrich versus a Hoosier, right? Going to vary, but my guess is that is yes, but I do not have any significant thing to add to that, other than that, boy, it's there somewhere. Okay. When do you start modifying suspension settings? Art asked that question. Same thing as the camber, right? It's you get yourself where the tire pressures are somewhat close, and then maybe it's camber, maybe it's suspension. Then you come back and you tweak your tire pressures again. It's this process that it's never ending. It's just like the chart that we started with, right? You're learning more, and then you go back and you learn some more. That's what makes racing and motorsports and data such an endless task that is so much fun, is that every little tweak changes it, and you continually adjust. So kind of interesting. I already answered that one. And the last one that I've got up here that is fresh is, so what are you going to do to the car to work on the braking? The data is fine, but what is the most important tool of the car? But what about the most important tool of the car? I always think, and I'll let James kind of close up with this one, David, the data here is a combination of the car and the driver. We're going to work on the brakes. The question came when you were talking about what you're going to work on, as far as braking for the upcoming season, and but the braking is part driver and part car, right? So you're going to do some things, you're going to try some different things, and then you're probably going to adjust some pads or adjust a couple things. You're going to come back and look at it again. The end goal being ultimate speed with the things that you're doing to the driver and the car. They are broken apart, but they are related. What do you think, James, as far as
I would say so I have a lot of changes that we can obviously make can adjust bias. There's not a huge amount that we can change, to be honest. Pads bias, not a huge amount. The other thing you can also do is you can hire a coach. So that might be something else that I think about as well. Because again, just like everything, I don't know what I don't know. And if someone can be in the same car as me and be a second faster, but the data will show me how that's happening, then I can figure out how I can get myself comfortable. Now, I have experienced in different scenarios that people brake differently. And I had scenarios when I was in the Spec E46s where I'd race with colleagues and friends of mine. One, his brake pressure application on initial hit was so hard that he could wake up a tire compound so quickly that he could change his brake point, because he would make sort of like we were using PFC brakes, and there was a type that was a sprint brake pad that you had to hit the brake so hard to warm it up to get it to really function properly. Whereas I always opted for a slightly different compound where I didn't hit the brake pedal so hard, but I had a smoother application so the car didn't get as unsettled. And over time, I developed my style because I was never that kind of driving style. Now, I could have tried to adapt to his, but then how do you find that point which is happy for you? So that's what I personally got to figure out, and that's what I'm going to work on. And it could be car, could be component, and it's definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, driver.
And it's all part of the data journey, right? You're applying it to the car, the driver, the track, the conditions. You end up with this, as you mentioned when we first started out, this data journey. It might be in many different parts of your life. It's not just your motorsports life. This is reality of the way that the human mind works, I suppose, in everything, not just motorsports. So it's
couldn't agree with you more. And isn't it fun? This is the part that, for me, the figuring this stuff out is part of the development. I think it was Ross Bentley who said, I've polled people as to why they race. And it's a surprise that not everyone is all about winning. It's about personal development, and it's about figuring it out. And this, for me, is a big part of figuring it out, which I actually find very enjoyable.
There you go. There you go. And Matt, I know Matt is of that same mind as well. So I see him shaking his head yes as we were chatting. and me too. Me too. This has been a fun session. I hope that some of you that have watched this live got as much out of it as I did. But what I might suggest to everybody, I think this is the right thing to do anyway, but go back and watch these on YouTube, this one especially, and break it down. We talked about the data journey, we talked about tire temperatures and pressures, and we intermingled it all, and you might have missed a few things. This one might be one of those that you really would want to sit down and watch again, and because we jumped around a little bit, which I think was fun, and we talked about things at a much different level. So I hope you had a good time watching it. Let's move on to the kind of the closing slides and talk about what our next webinar. The next webinar is going to be a fun one too. All of these videos, this one here will be up in about an hour or so. We've got this will be number 144 videos, all of our webinars, plus tons of other previous previous videos that we have up there. Lots and lots of great material up there. To go ahead and take a look at it at our YouTube site. We're a customer support company. We're here to help everybody that's watching these, and everybody that has ever watched anything like this or uses our products. Give us a call if you have some questions. If we don't see you at the track, give us a call. They're at the number, and look forward to helping you. I know our two guests and the one that's our next webinar are big proponents of that as well. James, Matt. We're going to announce that Peter's going to be our next webinar co-host. All guys that just huge support guys and out there to help tons of people. So customer support, it's a big part of this, where it's a learning journey, and which means we have a lot to learn. So keep that in mind. The next webinar is something we've got a lot of feedback from, a lot of questions on over the years, and it's peaked recently. So I moved it up in the rotation of what we think we're going to do here on our next few webinars. And so what we're going to talk about is data in non-ECU race cars. What we have talked a lot about, and kind of ironic, but James's the data we just looked at was a non-ECU race car, right? But so we're going to talk about the hardware. How do you put it in? What can you get? We have a lot of people that the mindset is becoming that I need a modern car with an ECU with a CAN connection to be able to get valuable data. And what we want to talk about is half of the world out there have race cars that are that maybe do not have a bunch of ECU based data that is available to them. Let's chat about that topic and see what's out there. How do we mount these things? How do we get the, what are the right sensors to put on to start the process, and what kind of value can you get out of data in non-ECU race cars? So that's what we're going to talk about a week from today on February 9th with our co-host Peter Krause. So that'll be another great webinar. Looking forward to that. The some contact information, James's contact information there on the bottom. Again, he's got a YouTube site out there with tons of seminars he's put, not seminars, but training videos that he's put together. He's putting them out all the time. He just did one on XY plots, scatter plots, using Race Studio 3, the beta software. Plus he's got a bunch of Race Studio 2 stuff as well. There's James's email address if you'd like to get a hold of him. I didn't include Matt's on here, but I think most people know how to get a hold of Matt at trailbreak.net. And but I appreciate both of you coming on. James, I know it's a lot of work to put these things together, and you did a great job as usual. And I appreciate you being here. Matt, I appreciate you jumping in and helping because of the learning styles and the sessions you guys had to open some eyes. So anything left you want to maybe close with, James?
No, just a thank you. It's lovely to do these. I appreciate it very much to be able to talk to you all. And as I said, if anyone's got any questions or anything, you can find me by my website. You can find me on via email. Happy to chat on many of these, which some people have already started to do, which is nice. And so hopefully you all found it useful.
Perfect. Matt, have anything to add on the way out?
No, the same thing. I had a ton of fun. And if people have more questions or anything like that, I'm happy to talk and happy to help folks out.
Perfect. And I wrote something down as you were starting up, and I didn't want to, I thought it'd be a great closing line here. For me personally, as I've gone through this process, it's of the learning, the analysis and the learning styles. The deeper I wade into this pool of data, and I've been at it now for 15 or 20 years, the deeper I wade into this pool, thinking that I would only get up to my knees, the deeper I wade, the deeper the pool gets. And so which the more I know about some of these basic things, the more then it opens up, like the questions did today. What about camber? Well, yeah, of course. Now that now you mentioned it, of course we would want to have another graph for that, right? The deeper I wade into this pool, the deeper the pool gets. There's always more to learn, and that's why we're all here. And it just continues to keep getting better and better. And I appreciate everybody coming. Looking forward to seeing everybody next Tuesday. Thanks for joining us, and boy, we're gonna have a good time next time too. Thanks, guys.